For whatever reason,
progress.
it's weird. All right, so let's go back to Haggadah and what it means. Everyone get a good sense of what the word is about, what it's trying to tell you? Haggadah is about doing the opposite of what Sam encountered in his educational process. Christianity has been really good at narrowing down and saying, this is what Christianity is all about. And literally fighting each other about who has the truth. Judaism and the Midrash, and specifically for me, the Haggadah, is an expanding view of Scripture. That the way God acts and the way God speaks continually moves forward. Continually is more than it used to be. And you're invited into that. Christianity is not as good at that because we've wanted to have the right answer, the only right answer.
And they're okay, it seems, with not. Judaism is more okay with not having the right answer than Christianity is. I mean, my God, the one thing he pointed out was, there's just volumes of Midrash and volumes and
enormous.
Yeah, it's like, okay, that they like that and thrive on that. And I'm not sure where Christianity got so off of that, where it changed, or why it changed.
I can tell you at least part of why it did. Part of it is what Ron talked about in the destruction of the temple, which is where much of that definitely determined much of the writing that was going on.
Yeah.
And in that, Jews as well as Christians were trying to decide what's next. How do we define what's next? And so Christianity developed in a way that says we are. And so they said, we have the Messiah, we have the truth, you have to go with us. That wasn't the biggest place where that happened, though. It happened more several hundred years later, as we became legitimized by Constantine. And in legitimizing us, this was when we began having councils. We had to decide who didn't belong. And you know why we had to decide that? Because for empire, an expanding thing is problematic. A controlled, known population is much simpler.
Yeah.
And so we became a small version of ourselves, rather than the expanding version that was the legacy that Judaism tried to give to us.
But there were other Christianities or other versions until then, and that's, unfortunately, we lost them all, and we lost that perspective.
The good news is we haven't lost them completely. Things like the Dead Sea Scrolls being found,
right,
is us recovering some of what those old traditions were. Those other parts of us that got written out of the story. During Lent, I should tell you this year, we're going to try to deal with some of that. Through Lent, we're going to look at Celtic saints. The Celts were part of Christianity since way in the beginning. Galatians, for example, is a Celtic community that was in Asia Minor. And they moved across and found their greatest voice in Scotland, Ireland. But they have a very different and marvelous way of looking at things. But Christianity tried really hard to write them out of the story. Why is having a simplistic, easy answer better for some people than to have the larger story?
Is it a sense of ownership?
I'm sorry, say that once again, Sam.
Is it a sense of ownership?
It's easier to own something that is small enough that you can understand it, isn't it?
Ah, yeah.
And I think it goes back to your empire too. Control is so much easier when you have a definitive answer, and this is the way we do things, and you go from step A to step B to step C. Whereas when you let each person be responsible for their relationship, oh man, then it gets really messy, and you can't control what the outcome's going to be.
Yeah, but think of what it is you're really trying to control.
People and wealth.
I think it's much bigger than just controlling people. It's trying to control God and how people understand God.
You really think Constantine cared about God?
I think Constantine cared about the fact that these people he was trying to control cared about God, so he had to control the eyes of God.
Yeah.
In order to control the people. And that's kind of sad, isn't it? That which we celebrate as being infinite, without end, right? The divine in the world, we try to dumb down to a small size so that we can control. And we all try to make God into a size where we can understand, but it's when we stop, once we have an understanding that's small, and don't allow it to continue to expand. And it's even worse when it's not me that does that, but you. Because oftentimes you take things in ways that I don't understand.
Yeah.
Which brings us to Easter. Why do people go to a very bodily resurrection? Why is that a simple solution? Because we understand bodies. We can feel bodies. We can touch and to some extent control bodies. Spirit is a much harder thing than that. But I loved, if you read the second chapter from the resurrection book, I love the way that Dr. Spong looked at Paul's writings and said what Paul was trying to do was take us completely away from the body and put us into that spirit relationship before and after death. That Jesus doesn't die because he's been raised into the Father and become something different than the body form that we understand. But I understand how that works. I was 9 years old when Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered. I knew about the event, but I didn't really learn about Dr. King there. You know when I began learning about that? Later, as people resurrected him, telling the stories about him, reading, sharing his work so I could hear that. And he became alive again in me because of the way somebody else told those stories. He lives on because someone didn't let him die. That to me is what I think Paul was trying to express in that idea of Jesus being raised into the Father. And Dr. King, I think his voice is more powerful today than what it was in the 1960s.
Well, some of his voice.
Some of his voice.
Yeah.
Right. We don't understand it. But even my conservative friends have an honoring of Dr. King that I kind of hate. because they don't seem to be holding up all the best of Dr. King, but they do honor him and they do see the importance of who he was.
Well, I'm wondering if the Hollywood version, before there was Hollywood, because in Mark, it just, it's a story and the women run away because they're afraid. And then by the time you get into later the Gospels, there's a body and Mary Magdalene goes up to hug it and he says, "Don't cling to me." So it seems that the further on, the larger the story gets. And there's a certain attraction to that for some people.
So how do we resurrect resurrection? How do we take it from what often has become an unuseful way of thinking about it towards something else? It's interesting that Dr. King in these last 2 weeks has dealt with two key issues: atonement last week, and this week resurrection. And he completely writes off, I believe, the ability to resurrect atonement, that it's been corrupted too far. But with resurrection, this Easter moment, I think it's so important, so essential, that he says, I have to resurrect it. That it's imperative that we get a better view of this than what we have. Why is it so important, do you think? Why is resurrection important for you? Or maybe it's not.
Is it something that we spend hours and hours contemplating and thinking about? Not for me. You were talking about your early age, and that I think when I joined the Boy Scouts, our job over Easter was to help park cars in the South Rim of Grand Canyon. And we loved it. Got up at 5 o'clock in the morning or something, and the traffic began to come in. People were going to celebrate the Easter sunrise service. And get who the announcer was. It wasn't the minister. It was an announcer that was well known on KTAR Phoenix that would come to the canyon, and he would describe the sunrise, the resurrection of a new day. And he would be stationed at Yavapai Point, maybe, or he might be stationed at Plateau Point down in the canyon. But everybody enjoyed the conversation with his name, thank heavens. And gone. And that was Easter to me. And hey, next Saturday, I'm going to a high mass at Pius X. And I'm really intrigued to go because it's been a long time since I've been to a mass. I'm not Catholic. It's a funeral. And the last time I was at a mass was at the University of Arizona, someplace. Oh, Father Mac. Father Miles and Father Mac. Mac, I think his name was. Now I want to look at the process of the ritual with new eyes, I hope.
But for me, Sam, that's why Easter is important. Not the day of Easter, but the concept of Easter. It's because for me, Easter means, when did I learn to see something with new eyes?
And we go to the Methodist church and you see the cross, and Christ is not on the cross because he has arisen. And you go to the Catholic church and he's still on the cross.
Right, because it's a different viewpoint.
Well, yes,
can both be good, or can both be just holding Jesus in a certain space. Because in Mormonism, they don't use a cross at all in their chapels.
What do they use?
They might have a painting, but up in front there's basically not a decoration usually.
Ah,
You know, one of the things that Spong said that I kind of went, huh, I first time I've just been able to say, wow, I really disagree with that, was he made the comment that Easter was a new thing. It created that this resurrection created a new thing, a new holiday. And not the holiday is not, I can't even think of the word he used, but it was a new situation. And I
New
was sitting there
concept.
going, no, it seems to me that almost every tradition holds some kind of Easter type celebration, some kind of resurrection type celebration. It's just that ours happens to deal with the Christ. And for me, it seems like it's so important because it's taking us from this earthly, just earthly being into a place of actually really gaining communication or being in that spirit with God.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that for us, Jesus is that way into not Jesus is the way, but he shows us how to have that relationship that we haven't had before.
But I think that's his point, Dr. Spong's point. I don't think he was saying that in opposition to other moments. I think he was saying that for the people who were following Jesus, somehow that Easter moment, whatever it was,
Yeah.
changed the way they were doing it. And so as Paul began looking, as he said, Peter noticed it first, or Cephas, as he wrote about, and then the other disciples, and then the 500, and he makes this list of the folks who have in some way been changed by.
And I loved that, seeing beyond, not seeing with my eyeballs, but seeing in depth, seeing beyond, seeing and gaining more knowledge and more understanding, and how much more that word really encompassed instead of just seeing.
Yeah. I love that as well, because I've had moments in my life, as you probably have, where before and after that moment, I was different. It can be as simple as the day your first child was born. Well, that's not a simple day, but it's a pretty universal day, isn't it? That when that child is born, suddenly the one who gave birth, as well as the one who fathered that child, are completely changed by that moment, right? Never to be
that's right.
quite the same. And what other moments are like that for you? When else have you essentially been resurrected from an old self into a new way of viewing? Marriage can be that way. What else?
Is it possible to have an ongoing revelation?
I think that's what's important to me about Haggadah, is that it's an ongoing revelation. And it's saying that, see, this event of Jesus brings God back alive, just like, and all the parallels that were drawn between the cross and other events, right? Events from the Old Testament is a way of being able to say, just like it used to, God was present here, and it points towards, and God will be. I think that's what they were trying to do as they wrote. They were saying, remember how Moses freed the people? Jesus freed people as well. And I think that's what Haggadah is trying to do. Now, what's interesting about it is that typically, if you remember how Dr. Spong did it, he showed how each time people go maybe a step beyond, a step further. So when Paul says that that God raised Jesus from death into God's presence, you know what he was going beyond?
Just dying.
Yeah, he was going beyond the idea of Sheol.
Mhm.
Old Testament has a sense of when you die, you go into the place of nothingness, Sheol. Instead, Paul was taking it one step further and saying, no, you go into the everythingness that is God. You become part of the oneness rather than the nothingness. And so that at least was part of the incredible nature of what was being proclaimed in this new space.
Can I just make a comment on the talking about the I guess for me anyway, Easter is sort of not exactly a manufactured story, but because of all of the things that happened after what we call Jesus' resurrection, the different people that he interacted with at various different times. And there were all these witnesses to this. And they were, anytime you have that kind of profound experience and start relating it to people, or talking about it with people that even shared that with you, you have to have a reason for being. It has to have a reason why it happened. That's just human nature, is to look for reasons. So Easter kind of, to my way of thinking, was the reason that this all happened. And so you've got, you've got all these people having these experiences, and they needed to have a way of talking about it. They needed to have a reason to explain it. And so I think that by not, over the years, with the mystics and, whatever, just people on the road, there are people who claim that they saw Jesus, or Jesus has been with them, or they've had this experience of his presence, and they knew it was his presence. And so in that, we need to, I don't know how to say it.
Stay with it. You're getting there.
Anyway, I just think that we need to have something to validate these experiences, and that those kinds of things are what creates meaning with these stories. That the New Testament is basically creating a reason for people's experiences that couldn't be sort of erased by people who would erase it, where it maybe didn't fit in to whatever. So anyway, that's just my take on it, is that somehow or another, Easter was the culmination of the experiences that people had, like Paul on the road to Emmaus. I mean, he needed a reason to have had that experience. He needed to talk about it, and he needed to have a reason for it. So anyway, that's it.
No, I think your insights are right on. You're going down, I think, exactly what this is trying to struggle with. How do we give voice to a mystical experience? How do we give voice to something that doesn't quite make sense?
Mm.
So think about it this way. We've all lost someone that we've loved.
Yeah.
Probably we've also all had the experience of sensing them, hearing them, at least feeling part of who they were with us post that loss,
Mhm.
right? How do we give voice to that? But I think this is part of what Dr. Spong is trying to tell us is what happened here. And he that the New Testament is trying to refer back to, these gospel writings are trying to refer back to, see how God continued being present there, God continues to be present here. See how God was in communication at that time, through Jesus, he communicated again. And they're trying to draw those kind of parallels that say that there is a space of mystic happening right now. Cephas saw it, the disciples saw it, I saw it. What's interesting about that set of things, do you know what often happens because of that list that Paul makes? People say Paul was the last one. And they
Yeah.
stop the list at that point and they say, and it doesn't happen like that anymore, which I think was exactly the opposite of what Paul was trying to say, is that all of these things were an ongoing speaking of the divine, and they turn it off and say, but it doesn't happen any longer. Isn't that amazing? He was expanding and they close it down.
Is it the church that closed it down? The
It's
people
church
of the church that closed it down, or was it sort of the disciples? Because I don't see it as, I see it as the church closing it down because they couldn't answer those questions.
Yeah, I think
you have a mystical experience, and you go to the priest in the church and you say, I had this experience, and they don't know what to do with it.
right.
So, you know, it makes it difficult for them, and not having the answers kind of casts a shadow on their credibility.
Right.
How many of us, right
that
here,
Oh, go ahead.
in our group, how many of us have had an experience some point in their life where the only explanation you could give is one of, at least ethereal. It may not be that I saw Christ or that I saw God, but it's something else. For instance, we constantly sense the presence of not only our deceased son, who's been, he died at age 23, he'd be 48 right now. And there are times when both Phyllis and I look at each other and we say together, hi, Rob. And we can smile and go on. It's as if we walked to his memorial tree at Panhandle Walkway up toward Michael Perry Park. That's not right, but anyway, we walked there for his tree. And this time of year, everything is bare except for the Palo Verde trees. But we have a desert willow. And our neighbor, who also lost a son, has a tree right near us, near there. And we stand in front of bare trees and we say, hi, Rob. And he's there. I don't see a body. it's not that kind of an image, but there's a sense that he's next to us. One time, right after I think it was Compassion Friends people went to a meeting, it doesn't matter. There was a guy speaking to us who was a mystic. And somebody asked him, well, what do you see? And he says, it's as if there's a plate glass window next to this audience, next to this auditorium. And there's all these people who I don't know that are on the other side of this window, and it's soundproof. I cannot hear them, but they're all waving at me. And they're saying, pick me, pick me, pick me, pick me, talk to me, talk to me. And then he says, and once in a while, I get a message. For instance, and he says, these people here said, for those people's lives that were in the audience, you need to move the desk in your bedroom, put it outside. And the wife or someone said, good heavens, we've been arguing about that for a long time. And he didn't know them, but the mystical, whatever it was, moved him to say that. And he said he was getting a message. I'm not going to argue with him on that. That's fine. That's it. Is that also something that Paul could have had?
I believe so, Sam. The hard part is this. I don't have any way to judge your mystical experience except for through my own experiences.
Yeah.
And too often that means that if it sounds foreign to what I've seen, then it can't be right. As if I've had every experience that there is.
Okay.
Right? But that's often what the church has done. And to the extent that we've made lists of this is how those mystical experiences happen. But here's what I know. For example, we have a group that has been very connected to St. Francis that looks at near-death experiences. I have not had a near-death experience, but here's what I recognize. Whatever it is, whether it's made up in their head or is a true spiritual experience, what I know is it changes that person usually dramatically and deeply. And so whether or not I understand it, what's more important is that I live in the space that is different for them. And I encourage them to be in that new space. Instead, we've done a whole bunch of shutting down mystical experiences, shutting down resurrection because it doesn't fit our rules. But see, that's a control thing, because expanding things are more uncontrollable. So if I want to keep us within a certain pattern, I have to narrow down the possible responses. But does that seem like a God thing?
Well, for lack of a better explanation, you can say it must have been God. It might have been that chili that you ate the day before.
It might have been. I think that there's reasons why sometimes we have to say no to something. Is it hurting someone else? For example, right? Is your assertion of this, making it more difficult for other people? Then we have to mediate in between that. But typically, why does it matter if someone goes in a different direction than my experience?
And
But it's just,
if it's hurting to someone else, then there has to be a stop somehow.
Yeah.
Maybe. So then you can stop all the people that pick up the guns and go out in the schools and shoot people.
Yeah.
and say, well, that's not the reason. They've got mental problems. Well, I agree with that. You're right, but that's not the solution, nor is that the full answer.
The
I
difficulty. Oh, go ahead, Ron.
was going to say that that reality is so large and it comes in different ways. You know,
Yeah,
I was part of that. I never had a near-death experience, but I was part of that group way back in the 80s when it was at Catalina Methodist. And people who've had those experiences will often perceive different things, but the crux of the story is the same. And it's that, I guess it's that ability to just to be able to recognize that, like, my experiences are going to be completely different from everyone else here because of the life I've lived, and to that I guess is part of drawing the circle wide, to use the old hymn, or the new hymn actually.
I think a lot
And
of it. I'm sorry, go ahead.
it's because we want to make a science out of it when it's something larger, something that we actually, I think you're right, it's something we can't control because we're trying to control that reality. And that's just not possible.
I think it's important, though, that we remember what Bishop Spong points out about the resurrection stories that we have. It says two things. First of all, none of them were first-person eyewitness accounts. These are all people that are retelling or down the road telling what that experience was. And second of all, that these accounts we have, almost every detail in those accounts is contradicted somewhere else.
Yes.
Of the accounts. And so for these early writers, it wasn't necessarily that they were defining a definitive truth. You know, my tradition had this attempt to harmonize the Gospels. Does everyone know what a harmony of the Gospels is?
Yeah,
It tries to take the four Gospels and turn them into one story.
yeah.
And that's impossible to do, right? It doesn't stop people from trying to do it, but they are not telling one story. They are telling at least
only if it's Fox News.
Yeah. And but it's almost as if the early church was saying there's different ways of viewing this, and that's not a bad thing.
You know what I find interesting, thinking about that, is that other oral traditions, the Celtic or just any other oral tradition, they seem to understand that that's the intent, or that's going to happen. There's going to be different interpretations, and for whatever you want to fall back on, we said no, you can't do that. That it's an oral tradition that must have been told the same way all the way through the 4,000 years of history to when we wrote it down. Where, you talk to a witch or you talk to shaman or whatnot, they understand that it's an oral tradition, and maybe they saw it that way, but I see it this way and you may see it this way. And it's so accepted.
Yeah. I experienced that just today. Judy gave me a book. She gives me books all the time to be able to digitalize them so we can use them for children's moments. So she gave me this book, which is a children's song, Skinnamarink Dinka Dinka. Do you know guys know that song?
Uh-uh.
It's a fun little song. So the name of the book is Skinnamarink. Now what's funny about this is in here they do Skinnamarink with a Y. I've always had it Skinnamarinka. That's how I learned that song. It's a small difference, but it's a difference. And one of my hobbies was collecting children's music. I compiled a book of children's music and did presentations about it all the time. And what I learned is these kid folk songs have a lot of different ways that they're sung. And I would tell at the workshops I would do, I said, I'm going to sing it the way I know it. If you know it a different way, you go ahead and sing whatever words you want, whatever tune you have, right? We recognize that in something like that, but in religious things, it feels like we've been more stuck in the get the right answer, the only answer. We've done a lot of stuff in opposition to each other, haven't we?
Mm-hmm.
The biggest split of the Christian church, the East-West split. Do you know what the essence of that argument was?
That I used to. I don't remember now.
2 words. Et filio. Those 2 words were the essence of a major split. And it means, it comes from the phrase, the Spirit proceeded from the Father, et filio, and the Son. And the Eastern Church said, no, it doesn't proceed from the Son. Spirit only proceeds from the Father, not the Son. Western Church said, no, it's got to be and we split because of that. And we've been splitting since over right answers, singular right answers that have to be true.
So the Eastern Church so the Eastern Church does not believe in the divinity of Jesus?
They do not believe, they do not raise Jesus to the same level that the Western Church
As
does.
the Western Church does. Okay.
I will tell you that I think much of the Western Church doesn't believe in Father any longer, especially especially evangelical Christians. They believe in the divinity of Son, and Father is kind of just an appendage of that. That's my take on it. They may pray to Father, but they're really saying, they'll pray in this way: Father, we're glad that you died on the cross for us. Do you see what they're saying? They subsumed everything about Father into Son.
Right.
And instead of expanding, they've narrowed down to a small answer, and which is what we've done again and again in Western Christianity, I believe. And we've put our right answers in opposition to each other. The good news is that I think we're in a place where we're turning the corner and going differently than that. Hopefully.
Something that still bothers me. I mean, because I can see the way that I see this is that it's a different, Jesus lived a terrible life. I mean, he was probably born at least with questionable reputation. He dies at 34, completely alone at the hand of the Roman Empire, and which later destroyed the temple. And I'm sure there's a tie-in to that because it was written afterwards. But it's a sense of that the divine is something greater than empire, and that we move beyond the story of Daniel in the lion's den and the Exodus with the miraculous into to a larger understanding of the divine. But my concern is that Paul and the original Christians, from what we know, did believe that he was going to come back and rule, so that brought that old sense of God's going to fix it. This outside God is going to fix it. And we're still stuck in that 2,000 years later. We're still stuck in that same pattern.
I wonder though, Ron, how much Paul believed that was us writing that back into the story. I think Paul believed that Jesus would be present again with us, but we turned it into Jesus is going to come down in a rapture in his physical body and going to save the whole world. That is not preached in Paul's gospel.
Okay.
Right? And all of the better stuff is not what is there, but that's what we've written into it. That's the story.
I do not believe that.
Truth.
I don't know. I never believed that.
Yeah.
I didn't believe that Christ was going to come down with a Breck hairdo either. A nice blonde curl.
Nice blonde, long.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
The good news is that we don't have to solve this today, because next
Okay.
week we have,
That's
we're
good.
going to talk about the ascension. The ascension won't take a whole hour, and we have time next week to continue to talk about Easter and about resurrection and about how new life happens. One of the things I'm very interested in hearing is how it is that you have experienced Easter. What is it that makes death less relevant for you? Right? Where has your experiences through life pushed the importance of death back some? The
Can we,
immediacy, the primacy of death. So I'm
Can we-
interested in hearing those kinds of stories. I'm interested in hearing, in here, Dr. Spong uses a thing where he says timelessness. But these stories are one of timelessness. Where has your spiritual path led you to some of that timelessness?
Mhm.
so you don't want us to bring a chocolate rabbit?
No.
Bring the chocolate rabbit, man. I mean, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
The good news is that I think St. Francis has a good grasp of how to do Haggadah. We allow more stories to be part of the story than just a singular, everyone has to follow along this line. It's hard because that's messier. Have you noticed St. Francis is sometimes messier than some churches where people have more uniformity about them? And we do that because it cleans up easier.
But it's
Yeah.
been a lot more fun, I got to tell you, since I've been here and been involved in the messiness and just looking around. It's a great experience.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think we should welcome that. We just have to figure out how to deal with the raggedy bandedness of it rather than the nice uniformed, everyone's the sameness. Right? Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Sorry about my thing going weird. I'll try to make sure there's a recording somewhere.
It was
record
probably
here
God.
and there, and we'll figure out how we put it all together.
I just wanted to bring up the analogy because it seems so present. Because democracy is messy and authoritarian is not. And I think that's something we're facing right now. And it hurts to see that many Christians are on that side of authoritarian.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm putting that down because that's an apt analogy. And we often try to go to the simpler, but that's often simplistic rather than good for us. So thank you, Ron.
Yeah.
Isn't it kind of a power play too, when
Often a power play.
the control is much more powerful when people have to think the same thing, people have to fit into the box. And when you don't fit into the box, like we don't at St. Francis, you know, everybody's got their own idea of it. And, you know, we kind of are allowed to experience other people's thoughts and kind of grow from that. So,
You know what we usually mean, Joyce, when we say fit in the box?
no.
We mean fit into the box that I feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Right?
that's what it is, the control issue.
Yeah, not me fit into your box.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's why so many people walk away from the church. It's just,
Right.
you know, they have their own idea of what their box should be or is, and it doesn't fit in with other churches.
Right. And it's given no validity, no space to be said. Questions are not allowed very often in churches, or I shouldn't say that. The right questions are the questions that we've asked last week and the week before and the week before that, but not the harder questions, the more challenging, divergent questions.
Welcome to St. Francis in the Foothills. bring your own box.
Hey, that's a really good, this is a really good segue into reminding you that on Sunday, we will start Adult Ed. And it will just be an introductory, this week will just be an introductory week into questions. We're gonna be doing the Living the Question series, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna see what questions you still have. Right? Because I've been here now for 7 years and I think I've solved all the questions that are there.
I'll bet.
And yet it seems you guys still have questions.
If it's clear tonight, go out and look at the stars for a few minutes
Oh,
All right.
and
All right.
think
Well,
about a bigger box.
Think about a bigger box. Is always a good thing. All right, my friends, thank you for your time.
All right.
Thank you.
Night
Thank you.
all. Good
Bye.
night.
Take care.
Right.